The children pressed their little noses against the corridor windows, their eyes brimming with envy as they watched Lucky Jack leave. Today, his mom and dad had come to pick him up. Lillian had seen this scene countless times, but it still pierced her heart every single time. Mrs. Hartman, the head of the orphanage, had caught her once, standing teary-eyed after one such goodbye. Her sharp gaze was enough to make Lillian flinch and cough awkwardly. "Don't you dare cry. Not in front of them," she had scolded in her office later. "They see everything. They know not everyone gets to go home with parents." Mrs. Hartman was tough, but she lived and breathed for the orphanage and its children. Beneath her stern demeanor was a heart that beat for the little souls fate had so cruelly forsaken. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again," Lillian had murmured before leaving. By then, the children had scattered, returning to their activities. Only 6-year-old Charlie lingered by the window, perched on the ledge, his small frame and unruly ginger hair making him look even more fragile. Lillian's heart clenched at the sight of him. Charlie was different. He never ran wildly down the halls or joined in the loud games with the others. Instead, he often sat quietly, watching from the sidelines. His peers didn't like him much, often teasing him with chants of "Charlie, wet pants Charlie," because even at 6, he hadn't yet conquered his nighttime accidents. He didn't seem to mind their mockery, but Lillian noticed how he avoided drawing attention to himself. He'd smile occasionally, a fleeting expression that he quickly suppressed, as if afraid someone might see and tease him more. "What are you doing here, Charlie? Why aren't you in your room?" Lillian asked softly, walking up to him. He turned his pale blue eyes, so full of sorrow it made her chest ache, toward her and shrugged silently. "Let me take you back," she offered, her voice warm. "Lily, you know Jack got picked up today, right? And Ruby says her parents are coming soon too. Is that true?" he asked with a mix of hope and resignation in his tiny voice. "It's true," she managed, her throat tightening. Charlie always called her Lily, his own affectionate nickname for her. Each time, it melted her heart, flooding her with tenderness. "No one will ever come for me," he said matter-of-factly, sliding off the ledge. The words struck like a blow. "Why would you say that?" she asked, crouching to meet his gaze. "Because I'm ugly," he whispered. "I'm ginger, freckled, and no one wants a kid who wets the bed." His gap-toothed smile only deepened the ache in her chest. "Don't say such things, Charlie," she began, but he interrupted. "Lily, it's okay," he said quietly. "I'm grown up now. I understand. People want perfect kids, not ones like me." Without another word, he shuffled back toward the dorms, leaving Lillian rooted in place, her emotions in turmoil. Charlie shuffled slowly toward the dormitory, leaving Lillian in a daze. "Mrs. Hartman, I want to adopt Charlie!" She burst into the director's office the next morning, her voice ringing through the quiet halls. "Shut the door and stop shouting for the whole orphanage to hear!" Mrs. Hartman snapped sternly. She pointed at the chair across from her. "Sit down," she ordered, lighting a cigarette with quick, irritated movements. "Calm down," she added, blowing out a thin stream of smoke. "Are you calm now? Good. Speak." "I want to adopt Charlie," Lillian said, her voice trembling but firm. From the moment she had met that freckled, lop-eared boy, something about him had nestled into her soul. For 3 months, she had worked at the orphanage, and every weekend when she left, she felt a peculiar ache, as though she were leaving a piece of herself behind. "You want to adopt him? Good for you." Mrs. Hartman's gaze was sharp, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Do you even understand what you're saying?" "I do," Lillian said, straightening her back. "She understands." Mrs. Hartman scoffed, shaking her head. "You've seen too much. Pitied too much. Do you think loving someone else's child is easy? They come with their own personalities, their own genes, and those genes can come back to haunt you, drugs, drinking, and once you take them, there's no going back." "But people adopt children," Lillian countered, her voice pleading. "They do," Mrs. Hartman said, stubbing out her cigarette. "But do we know how they manage afterward? Maybe they regret it. But a child isn't some store-bought item. No exchanges, no returns." "Mrs. Hartman?" Lillian stood abruptly, her eyes blazing. "Why are you trying to scare me? I've made my decision, and no one will change my mind." All right," the older woman said, waving her hand dismissively. "But why Charlie? He's not exactly healthy. He wets the bed at night. And, well—" "What? What's wrong with him?" Lillian asked, her voice rising. Well, he's ginger, freckled, lopsided ears. Mrs. Hartman smiled faintly, only the corners of her lips moving. He's perfect, Lillian said with conviction. Don't you see? He feels like he's already mine. And as for his hair, I like gingers, so there. Mrs. Hartman tilted her head slightly, studying the determined young woman in front of her. Let's say you're right. Do you have a husband? You know we only place children with full families. Lillian froze, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. She had already begun to feel the fragile hope of her dream shatter. Exactly, Mrs. Hartman said. Get married first, and then we'll talk. For now, this conversation is pointless. Fine, I will get married, Lillian snapped, her voice shaking with determination. And when I do, you won't be able to say no. She stormed out of the office so quickly that she didn't notice the fond, almost maternal smile that softened Mrs. Hartman's face as she watched her leave. Married. I have to get married. Lillian muttered to herself all day, the thought clinging to her mind like a stubborn shadow. Thinking was one thing, but acting on it? That was something else entirely. As it was, Lillian's romantic prospects were complicated. Despite her kind heart and natural beauty, she hadn't had much luck with men. Was it fear? Did they sense the old-fashioned purity and quiet grace about her, reminiscent of a heroine in a Turgenev novel? If so, it seemed to scare them away. Modern men, it seemed, found such qualities a barrier rather than a charm. By the time Lillian approached her 30th birthday, she had survived 2 brief and utterly disastrous relationships. I'll just walk up to the first man I see and ask him to marry me, she mused while waiting at the bus stop, her eyes darting to the men around her. I'll explain everything. It's just for appearances. He'll agree. I'll adopt Charlie, and then we'll divorce. If he asks for money, well, that's a problem. But I'll borrow some if I have to. She shook her head. I've completely lost my mind. I need to get Charlie out of that orphanage as soon as possible. And here I am fantasizing about men. The thought of Charlie tugged at her heart, sending a wave of emotion surging through her. Then, as if struck by lightning, an idea, a candidate for the role of her husband, flashed through her mind. By the time she reached her building, she was out of breath. She stopped outside to collect her thoughts, trying to untangle the jumble of words that had scrambled in her head during her frantic walk. Standing before the door on the ground floor, she felt shame and fear creep over her, threatening to turn her resolve to ash. Before she could reconsider, she pressed the doorbell, knowing there was no turning back. Her legs felt weak, her heart pounded in her throat, and a cold bead of sweat trickled down her back as the door opened. Yes? Can I help you? The man standing there, clearly confused, looked at her, a young woman he had never seen before. Lillian froze, her wide eyes staring at him dumbly as her silence stretched into awkwardness. Did you knock on the wrong door? He asked, tilting his head and giving her a polite, bemused smile. She shook her head quickly, unable to speak. A loose strand of hair fell across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear in a jerky motion. So you're here for me? His smile widened into something more open, though he still seemed clueless about what was happening. This time, she nodded. Well, then come in, he said, coughing to suppress a chuckle as he stepped aside, gesturing her into the apartment. Once inside, Lillian felt her last shred of courage slipping away. To keep from fainting, she blurted out in one breath, Will you marry me? Please? I need to adopt Charlie from the orphanage, and they only let married couples adopt. The man, who looked younger than she had anticipated, no more than 40, scratched his head, his face a mask of surprise. Well now, that's certainly an interesting turn of events. But what makes you think I'm a single man, just waiting for someone to propose to me? The neighbors, Lillian mumbled, biting her lip as soon as the words left her mouth. They said you were the most eligible bachelor when you moved in. That's all they talk about. Is that so? He laughed, a rich, amused sound. So you're in the market for an eligible bachelor? There's nothing funny about this, she snapped, her nerves finally giving way to irritation. The man raised his hands in mock surrender. My apologies, he said. It's just not every day that a stunning woman knocks on my door with a marriage proposal. I'm not some stunning woman, she retorted. I just want to give a child a home. He's small and ginger-haired. Charlie's the best. He's so gentle and quiet. But the other kids bully him. He wets the bed and thinks he's ugly because of his ears. And I love him. If you're not going to help me, don't waste my time. She finished her impassioned speech in a single breath, stepping back as the absurdity of the situation dawned on her. I'm sorry, I'll go, she murmured, lowering her head and turning toward the door. Oh, no, you don't, he said firmly. You've thrown me into this whirlwind, and now you want to run off? Not happening. Sit down. You're going to explain everything from the beginning. I'm Ethan, the man introduced himself, pouring freshly brewed fragrant coffee into a cup while studying his unusual guest with an amused smile. Lillian, she replied, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. Uncommon name, Ethan remarked. Though it suits you, everything about you seems extraordinary. Your beauty, your name, and your request. Lillian blushed even harder, but quickly straightened her back, her resolve kicking in. Flattery isn't appropriate right now. This is a business proposition. A business proposition? Ethan laughed openly, making no effort to hide his amusement. It's not funny. Lillian snapped, her cheeks growing even redder. My apologies, Ethan said, his expression turning serious. You have my full attention. Flustered, Lillian launched into her plan, her words tumbling out in a disorganized rush. Suddenly, she felt his hand gently rest on hers. Lillian, take a deep breath. I'm having a hard time following this whirlwind explanation of yours. In that moment, as she looked into his warm, understanding eyes, a strange sense of calm washed over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she thought, maybe everything will be okay. She smiled, and when Ethan returned her smile, it felt like the world had righted itself. What followed was a long, candid conversation. Ethan listened attentively, asking questions as needed, and the more they talked, the more composed Lillian became. All right, he finally said, leaning back in his chair. I'll marry you. It's easily the most unconventional adventure I've ever signed up for, but I'll help you achieve your noble goal. Then we'll see what happens. See what happens? Lillian asked nervously. We'll figure out the rest as we go, Ethan clarified with a reassuring smile. Now, let me walk you home. I live here, on the 5th floor, Lillian admitted, shrugging awkwardly. Well, well, Ethan chuckled. So you've had me scoped out for this role for a while now? No, Lillian protested, though his laughter didn't bother her as much as she thought it might. I just remembered you when I spoke with the orphanage director. Fair enough, Ethan said, brushing it off. We have a good mission ahead of us, so let's not sweat the details. Tomorrow, we'll meet at the registry office at 1 p.m. sharp. Lillian nodded, her face flushing again. Buoyed by his agreement, she flew up the stairs to her apartment, barely feeling her feet touch the ground. Tossing her coat onto a chair and her hat onto a shelf, she threw herself onto her bed and let out a victorious scream, her joy echoing off the walls. She could already imagine Charlie, shyly smiling as he explored her home, his happiness radiating in every step. The next day, Lillian arrived at the registry office, exhausted from a sleepless night of excitement and nerves. Ethan was already there, holding a bouquet of roses. He waved at her with a mischievous grin. Everything that followed, the signing of papers, the efficient speech, Ethan's jokes, was a blur to her. She had no idea how he had arranged everything so quickly. All she remembered was his gentle kiss and his words, "Congratulations, my dear wife." His casual switch to calling her "my dear" felt so natural that Lillian didn't even question it. Thank you, Ethan, she said, her smile radiant, though she had no idea how stunning she looked in that moment. Ethan handed her a folder. Here's the list of all the documents you'll need for the adoption process. I'll help you sort them out. I can handle it, Lillian insisted. You won't handle it alone, Ethan countered firmly. It's a lot to manage. My sister adopted a boy 5 years ago, so I know exactly how challenging it can be. Thank you, Lillian said, overwhelmed by gratitude as a wave of happiness swept over her. Ethan drove her to work, flashing her a knowing smile as he dropped her off. I'll pick you up later, he said. Seeing the protest forming in her eyes, he added, No arguments. I did it, Mrs. Hartman, Lillian exclaimed, bursting into the director's office. I got married. My husband and I want to adopt Charlie. Mrs. Hartman raised her eyebrows in surprise, then smiled warmly. Well, that was quick. When did this happen? Just now, Lillian beamed, handing over the still warm marriage certificate. Mrs. Hartman skimmed the document, her voice trembling with emotion as she replied, I never doubted you for a moment. Prepare the paperwork, and I'll help in any way I can. But don't tell Charlie yet. Let's not get his hopes up prematurely. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of guardian classes, documents, and endless bureaucracy. The hardest part for Lillian was keeping it all a secret from Charlie. Every time she hugged the freckle-faced boy with his unruly red hair, she wanted to whisper in his ear, "Soon, you'll be coming home, forever." Ethan was everything Lillian hadn't dared to hope for in a man. Strong, dependable, and kind. But as much as she feared admitting it to herself, she knew the truth. She had fallen for him. Completely and irrevocably. What scared her even more was realizing that Ethan seemed to feel the same way. She caught the way his sly, teasing eyes lingered on her. He seemed increasingly reluctant to let her leave, holding her hand a little longer each time they said goodbye. At last, the paperwork was complete. Everything was ready. Charlie could finally come home. "We'll pick him up together," Ethan said with a tone of quiet finality. "Thank you," Lillian whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And before she could stop herself, she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice soft but firm. "And tonight, we're moving your things in my place. It's time we became a real family. Charlie deserves loving parents." Lillian smiled against him, the kind of smile that comes from the deepest happiness. "All right," she breathed. At the orphanage, the caregiver knelt beside Charlie and gently said, "Your parents are here to take you home." Charlie froze, his little brow furrowing in confusion. "But I'm ugly, and I've got red hair. Nobody loves kids like me," he muttered with an unsteady voice. "That's not true," the caregiver replied warmly, smiling down at him. But Charlie's worries weren't so easily soothed. His favorite teacher, Miss Lily, hadn't been at work for 2 whole days. What if someone took him away before she even knew? "I'm not going," he declared, his voice trembling. "I love Miss Lily." The caregiver chuckled, taking his hand. "And it's Miss Lily who's here for you. Come on, you'll see." "Miss Lily?" Charlie's heart skipped as he gulped. Moments later, he was flying down the corridor, his voice ringing with excitement. "Miss Lily! Miss Lily!" He skidded to a stop in front of Lillian and Ethan, his wide, searching eyes darting between them. Blinking rapidly, he asked, "Are you taking me forever, Miss Lily?" Lillian knelt down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy. "We're taking you home for good, sweetheart. Me and Daddy both." Ethan crouched beside him, his smile steady and reassuring. He tousled the boy's fiery red hair. "Let's pack your things, Charlie. We've got a bed to build together. You'll help me, right?" "Of course," Charlie blurted out. Then his voice dropped to a whisper, as if afraid to break the magic. "Are you really my dad?" "I am," Ethan said with a soft smile. "And Miss Lily? She's your mom," Ethan confirmed, his heart swelling at the pure adoration in the boy's wide eyes. "I always knew Miss Lily was my mom," Charlie said thoughtfully. "But you being my dad, that's a surprise." Ethan chuckled, lifting Charlie into his arms. "It was a surprise to me too, buddy. Now go pack up your things. Mom's got a great story to tell you about me on the way home." Still clinging to both his new parents, Charlie felt his heart soaring. His red hair, his ears, none of it mattered anymore. He wasn't sure if he deserved this happiness, but he couldn't help thinking, maybe dreams really do come true. And so, a few months later, when the happy family was living together, Lillian often found herself thinking about how everything had fallen into place so unexpectedly. Once, she had thought that the world was unfair, that children like Charlie with red hair and big ears were always left in the shadows, neglected and unloved. But now, looking at her son, she realized that none of that mattered. It wasn't about how you looked, but who you were inside. In his eyes, there was a light, full of sincerity and warmth, and it was this that attracted people who were ready to give him love and a home. Charlie had always thought of himself as different, believing no one would love him, but fate smiled upon him, and now he was here, with his mom and dad, with a home and a real family. The lesson was simple. Even those who may seem unremarkable or unlucky at first can find their happiness if they have a kind heart, full of sincerity and a desire to love. Luck always finds those who are open to goodness, for love and light always attract each other, regardless of outward differences. That's how the story ends, friends. Join the conversation below and share your thoughts on this story. If you found it captivating, share the link with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story that will make your heart race. Your support inspires us to create more tales. Take care and see you next time.